the other wrinkle to all this, and the other thing that makes it very different from the previous two rules, I think at least in terms of its constitutionality, perhaps, is that this comes after Congress actually did something, right? The other two rules, Congress didn't do anything, and then the Biden administration said they wanted to drastically change how the gun laws were enforced. In this case, we had the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which did slightly alter what the definition for engaged in the business is under federal statute, right? And so I do wonder, given the more modest nature of the actual rule itself as it stands now, and we'll see where it ends up, but combine that with the change in language that Congress itself has authorized, which basically removed the livelihood requirement that had been attached to determining whether someone was engaged in the business and needed to get a license. I wonder what the odds of this surviving court scrutiny will be, because as you mentioned, the other two rules have done very poorly. And, has the Biden administration figured out a way to try and improve their odds in court, do you think?
I think that's the goal. I don't know if they're going to be successful or not. The ATF has argued in these other previous rules that, well, Congress gave us the authority under the Gun Control Act, right? So we may be referencing a law passed in 1968 versus a law passed in 2022. But the dispute is still over what Congress's intent was. And I think that is going to be true with this rule as well. Did Congress intend by removing that, reference to livelihood? Did they intend for the ATF to write a rule that is as broad and as vague as it is? And I'm guessing that there are going to be a lot of at least Republicans who voted for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act who say, no, that was not their intention. Particularly, again, if this comes back to bite them in the rear end. I think that was the design. I don't know how successful this will be. I think a lot of it probably depends on, who brings these cases, where these cases are brought, and ultimately whether or not the Supreme Court agrees to hear this particular legal challenge when one arises. Well,
it's funny you should mention the intention of the Congress people who voted for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, because I actually did go out and ask every single senator who's still serving that voted for the proposal, what they think the language change means. Now, only two of them responded, so there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to this quite yet. But I did get Senator John Cornyn, who was the principal negotiator for Republicans in the Senate on this bill. His office did respond. And he said, quote, "This language is tailored towards," or his office said, "tailored towards individuals regularly selling guns to strangers with the predominant motive of making money through a side business, like the person who sold the Midland shooter his weapon. And it is drafted in such a way that prosecutors will need to prove specific intent on the part of the unlicensed seller." Now, the other senator who responded was Joni Ernst, the Republican from Iowa. And she had a much more aggressive stance on all this. She said, quote, "President Biden is twisting the law to fit his liberal gun-grabbing agenda. His administration's latest attack on lawful gun owners clearly oversteps both the intent and the text of the law at the expense of the average gun seller. Senator Ernst has repeatedly defended FFL holders and will continue to stand up against the Biden administration's attack on Second Amendment rights." So there are two quotes from two people who signed, who helped craft and voted for this change. And I do imagine that will be a relevant thing once the court challenges come up, if this rule is successful in getting, approved, essentially.
Yeah, and it is interesting, because again, you've got two Republican senators who voted for this who have very different views. Now, I would remind Senator Cornyn's office that contrary to the assertion that, this targets people who are regularly selling firearms, as you and I just talked about, you don't have to sell a single gun under this rule to be deemed someone engaged in the business. So I honestly, just based on those two comments, I'd say that Senator Ernst has it right, at least as far as the ATF is interpreting the underlying legislation here.
Yeah. Well,
but given that Cornyn was the chief negotiator, I could definitely see why he would want to put a positive spin on it too.
Sure. And I mean, like Cornyn said, they think this is directed specifically at people who are doing this as a whole business, essentially. I mean, which is what this is supposed, right? Engaged in the business is the definition in there. So we'll see, I guess, how this all shakes out in court. I think it'll be interesting to follow how the ATF actually, how this all goes through rulemaking and the comment period and what comes out the other side of that. And then what court challenges, if any, end up happening and how much congressional intent plays into that. Especially because this is one of those fairly rare situations where we have very recent congressional intent on it. So, I think it's going to be a fascinating case to watch once that hits the courts.